On March 30th, 1981, a deranged gunman fired 6 explosive bullets in under 2 seconds, nearly killing a president who cracked jokes while bleeding to death, was saved by an agent inspired by the victim's own B-movie, and sparked a constitutional crisis when a cabinet member wrongly declared himself in charge. From bullets that should have detonated to a death ruled a homicide 33 years later. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about the day Ronald Reagan was shot. Fact 1. Exploding bullets. That mostly didn't explode. When John Hinckley Jr. opened fire outside the Washington Hilton Hotel on March 30th, 1981, he wasn't using ordinary ammunition. The 6 rounds loaded into his cheap revolver were called Devastator bullets, a specialty type of exploding ammunition that was designed to detonate on impact with its target. Each bullet contained a small charge of lead azide, an extremely sensitive explosive compound that was supposed to create a small explosion inside the victim's body, causing catastrophic damage far beyond what a normal bullet would inflict. These rounds were marketed as the ultimate man-stopping ammunition, and Hinckley had specifically sought them out for his attack on the president. But here's the truly bizarre part that most people don't know. Only one of the 6 Devastator bullets actually exploded as designed. The 5 other explosive rounds either failed to detonate completely or only partially functioned, which means the deadly chemical reaction inside the bullets simply didn't occur. The single Devastator that did work was the one that struck White House Press Secretary James Brady in the head, creating devastating injuries that left him permanently disabled. Medical experts later determined that if more of those bullets had detonated properly, the casualties would have been far worse, and Reagan himself might not have survived even with immediate medical intervention. The failure rate of these supposedly high-tech rounds was shocking to investigators who discovered that Devastator ammunition was notoriously unreliable and prone to malfunction. In a dark twist of fate, the very weapon Hinckley chose for maximum lethality ended up being far less deadly than he intended, purely because the explosive technology inside those bullets was fundamentally flawed and inconsistent. Fact 2. Agent saved by the president's movie. The man who saved Ronald Reagan's life that day was Secret Service agent Jerry Parr, and the reason he was even in that position traces back to a single afternoon in 1939 when he was just 9 years old. Young Jerry Parr sat in a movie theater watching a film called Code of the Secret Service, a low-budget action picture starring Ronald Reagan as dashing Secret Service agent Brass Bancroft. The movie was typical Hollywood fare of that era, with Reagan playing a heroic government agent who protected important officials and fought criminals with courage and quick thinking. But for the young boy sitting in that darkened theater, the film had a profound and lasting impact that would shape the entire course of his life. Parr later said that watching Reagan portray a Secret Service agent made him fall in love with the idea of serving his country in that exact capacity. And from that moment forward, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. Decades later, after working his way through the ranks of the Secret Service, Jerry Parr found himself assigned to the Presidential Protection Detail for none other than Ronald Reagan himself, the same actor who had inspired him all those years ago. On March 30th, 1981, when shots rang out, it was Parr who made the split-second decision to redirect the motorcade to George Washington University Hospital instead of returning to the White House. That single decision saved Reagan's life. As doctors later confirmed, the president would have died within minutes without immediate surgery. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man Reagan had inspired to join the Secret Service through a forgotten B-movie had become the agent who saved his life 42 years later. Fact 3. Tim McCarthy lost a coin. Toss Secret Service agent. Tim McCarthy wasn't supposed to be standing on that sidewalk outside the Washington Hilton on March 30th, 1981. In fact, he wasn't even supposed to be working that day at all, and the only reason he ended up taking a bullet to the chest was because of a simple coin toss with a fellow agent. McCarthy had made plans for his day off when a colleague asked if he would be willing to swap shifts and cover the presidential detail for a routine speaking engagement. Rather than one agent simply volunteering or the supervisor making the assignment, the 2 men decided to settle the matter the old-fashioned way by flipping a coin. McCarthy lost the toss, which meant he had to cancel his personal plans and report for duty to protect the president during what was expected to be a completely uneventful afternoon appearance. When John Hinckley opened fire, McCarthy was positioned close to Reagan as part of the protective formation, and his training kicked in immediately. In less than a second, McCarthy executed the maneuver that all Secret Service agents practice, but hope they'll never have to use in real life. He spread his body wide to make himself into a human shield, deliberately placing himself between the gunman and the president. One of Hinckley's bullets struck McCarthy directly in the chest, and he collapsed onto the pavement as other agents rushed Reagan into the armored limousine. McCarthy survived his wound after emergency surgery, but he spent weeks recovering from the gunshot that had punctured his lung. The irony of the situation haunted McCarthy for years afterward, knowing that a random flip of a coin had put him in the exact position to take a bullet meant for the President of the United States. Fact 4. 6 shots in 1.7 seconds. The speed of John Hinckley Jr.'s attack was so incredibly fast that most witnesses didn't even realize what was happening until all 6 shots had already been fired. From the moment Hinckley pulled the trigger on his first round to the instant his 6th and final bullet left the barrel, only 1.7 seconds had elapsed. That's barely enough time for a person to take a single breath, yet in that impossibly brief window, Hinckley managed to wound 4 people, including the President of the United States. The weapon he used was nothing special, just a cheap Rome RG-14 revolver that he had purchased for $29 at a pawn shop called Rocky's in Dallas, Texas. This particular model was known in law enforcement circles as a Saturday night special, a derogatory term for inexpensive, low-quality handguns that were mass-produced and sold for minimal cost. The Rome RG-14 was considered unreliable and poorly made, with a reputation for jamming and misfiring, yet Hinckley's weapon functioned flawlessly during those critical 1.7 seconds. Investigators later tested the exact firing rate and confirmed that Hinckley was pulling the trigger and releasing shots at a rate of more than 3 rounds per second, which required considerable speed and coordination, even with a simple revolver mechanism. The entire attack unfolded so rapidly that Secret Service agents, who are trained to react within fractions of a second, barely had time to process the first gunshot before the 6th bullet was already fired. Several witnesses standing just feet away from Hinckley later told investigators they heard what sounded like firecrackers or a car backfiring and only realized it was gunfire when they saw people falling to the ground. Fact 5. None directly hit the president. One of the most surprising details about the assassination attempt is that despite 6 shots being fired at close range in the president's direction, not a single bullet actually made direct contact with Ronald Reagan's body. Every round either struck someone else in the protective formation or missed entirely, except for the one that ultimately wounded the president, and that bullet never touched Reagan directly at all. The round that nearly killed him had actually struck the armored side panel of the presidential limousine first, and the impact with the reinforced metal caused the bullet to flatten into a thin disc shape, almost like a small coin. After ricocheting off the vehicle, this flattened projectile tumbled through the air and entered Reagan's body through the narrow gap between his raised left arm and his ribcage, slipping into his chest through a space of just a few inches. Because the bullet had already expended much of its energy hitting the limousine, it was traveling much slower than it would have been on a direct trajectory, but it still had enough force to penetrate his chest cavity and cause life-threatening internal damage. The entry wound was so small, less than the width of a pencil, that neither Reagan nor the Secret Service agents who rushed him into the car initially realized he had been shot at all. Reagan thought he had simply been injured by an agent pushing him into the vehicle, and he only mentioned feeling a sharp pain in his chest after the motorcade was already speeding away from the scene. The flattened, misshapen bullet that doctors later removed from near his heart was so deformed that ballistics experts had difficulty confirming it came from Hinckley's weapon, and they had to use microscopic analysis to make a definitive match. Fact 6. Reagan walked into the hospital. When the presidential motorcade screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance of George Washington University Hospital, Ronald Reagan did something that shocked the Secret Service agents and medical staff who witnessed it. He insisted on walking into the building under his own power. despite having a collapsed lung, massive internal bleeding, and a bullet lodged near his heart. The 70-year-old president refused to be carried or wheeled inside on a stretcher. Reagan later explained that he didn't want the American public to see their president looking weak or helpless, and he believed that projecting strength in that moment was part of his duty to the country. So with Secret Service agents supporting him on both sides, Reagan walked through the emergency room doors with his suit jacket still on, trying to maintain his composure and dignity even as his condition rapidly deteriorated. He made it approximately 20 or 30 feet inside the hospital entrance before his legs gave out completely and he collapsed to his knees on the floor, finally unable to continue the act of strength he was attempting to project. Medical staff immediately rushed forward and placed him on a gurney, and only then did doctors realize just how serious his condition actually was. Reagan's blood pressure was dropping rapidly, his skin was turning pale from blood loss, and his breathing was becoming labored and shallow. Nurses had to cut away his clothing, and when they pulled off his shirt, they found it was soaked through with blood from the small entry wound under his arm. Those brief seconds of walking into the hospital had cost Reagan precious time and energy that his failing body desperately needed, but he had accomplished what he set out to do. The lasting image captured by cameras was of a president walking into the hospital on his own 2 feet. Fact 7. I hope you're all Republicans. Even as Ronald Reagan was being rushed into surgery with a bullet near his heart and his life hanging in the balance, the former Hollywood actor couldn't resist delivering a perfectly timed one-liner. As medical staff prepped him for emergency surgery and the surgical team gathered around the operating table, Reagan looked up at the assembled doctors and said, "I hope you are all Republicans." The operating room fell silent for a brief moment before Dr. Joseph Giordano, the lead surgeon who happened to be a lifelong Democrat, smiled and replied, "Today, Mr. President, we are all Republicans." The exchange broke the tension in the room and even got a weak smile from Reagan before the anesthesia took effect. But that wasn't the only joke Reagan managed to crack during his ordeal. When First Lady Nancy Reagan arrived at the hospital and rushed to his side, clearly terrified and fighting back tears, Reagan looked at her and delivered another classic line borrowed from boxer Jack Dempsey. "Honey, I forgot to duck." Later, when he was waking up from surgery and couldn't speak because of the breathing tube down his throat, Reagan scribbled notes to his doctors and nurses, several of which were attempts at humor despite his critical condition. One note read, "All in all, I'd rather be in Philadelphia," a play on the famous W.C. Fields quote. Another note asked, "Does Nancy know about us?" when a pretty nurse was adjusting his bandages. The medical staff was amazed that a man who had just survived an assassination attempt and lost half his blood could still find the energy and mental clarity to crack jokes. But for Reagan, it was simply his natural personality shining through even in the darkest moment of his presidency. Fact 8. Haig's unconstitutional power grab. While Ronald Reagan was fighting for his life in surgery, and Vice President George H.W. Bush was on an airplane racing back to Washington from Texas, Secretary of State Alexander Haig made a decision that would haunt his political legacy for the rest of his career. Just a few hours after the shooting, with confusion reigning in the White House and reporters demanding answers about who was running the government, Haig rushed into the press briefing room looking flustered and out of breath. With television cameras broadcasting live to millions of anxious Americans, Haig stepped up to the microphone and declared, "As of now, I am in control here in the White House, pending the return of the Vice President." The statement was constitutionally incorrect and revealed either Haig's ignorance of the presidential succession order or his willingness to overstate his own authority during a crisis. According to the 25th Amendment and the Presidential Succession Act, the actual order after the Vice President goes to the Speaker of the House and then the President pro tempore of the Senate, with the Secretary of State coming in fourth, not third, as Haig had implied. What made the moment even more troubling was Haig's visible agitation and the almost manic energy he displayed at the podium, which did little to reassure a frightened nation that steady hands were guiding the government. His incorrect assertion of control sparked immediate criticism from constitutional scholars and political opponents who accused him of attempting an improper power grab during a moment of national vulnerability. Haig later tried to explain that he was simply trying to project calm and reassure the public that the government was functioning normally. But the damage to his reputation was done, and the phrase, "I am in control here," became a punchline and a symbol of governmental confusion during crisis. Fact 9. Bullet 1, inch from his heart. When surgeons finally located the bullet inside Ronald Reagan's chest cavity, they made a discovery that sent a chill through the entire operating room. The flattened projectile had come to rest less than 1 inch away from his heart. If the bullet's trajectory had been altered by even the slightest degree, or if it had penetrated just a tiny bit deeper into his chest, it would have struck his heart directly and almost certainly killed him within seconds, long before the motorcade could have reached the hospital. The surgical team faced an immediate and difficult decision that would determine whether the president lived or died. Some doctors argued that attempting to remove a bullet lodged so close to the heart was extremely dangerous, and that the safest option was to leave it in place and simply close up the chest, allowing Reagan's body to naturally encapsulate the foreign object over time. This approach was common medical practice for bullets that had settled in relatively stable positions, as the surgery to remove them often posed greater risks than simply leaving them alone. But other surgeons strongly disagreed, pointing out that a bullet sitting that close to the heart could shift position at any time, potentially causing catastrophic damage or triggering a fatal cardiac event weeks or even months down the road. After several tense minutes of debate while Reagan remained under anesthesia, the surgical team made the final call to extract the bullet, despite the risks. Dr. Benjamin Aaron performed the delicate extraction, carefully working around major blood vessels and heart tissue to remove the deformed piece of metal without causing additional trauma. The surgery was successful, and the bullet was placed in a metal container as evidence, its flattened shape a permanent reminder of how close the president had come to death. Fact 10. Doctors wore bulletproof vests for surgery. One of the most surreal moments in the aftermath of the assassination attempt occurred when doctors realized they might need to perform surgery while wearing bulletproof vests. The situation arose because one of the victims, Officer Thomas Delahanty, still had an unexploded Devastator bullet lodged in his neck, and surgeons knew that these rounds contained volatile explosive charges that could potentially detonate if disturbed during a medical procedure. The lead-azide compound inside the bullet was extremely sensitive to heat, pressure, and physical shock, which meant that surgical instruments, cauterizing equipment, or even the normal vibrations of the operating room could theoretically trigger an explosion. Hospital administrators and the surgical team faced an unprecedented dilemma. They needed to save Delahanty's life by removing the bullet, but doing so might literally blow up in their faces. The decision was made to ask for volunteer surgeons who would be willing to operate despite the danger, and several doctors immediately stepped forward to perform the procedure. To minimize the risk to the medical staff, the hospital obtained bulletproof vests that the surgeons wore under their surgical gowns, creating the bizarre image of doctors in full sterile gear with body armor protecting their vital organs. Bomb disposal experts from the police department were placed on standby just outside the operating room, ready to respond if the worst happened and the bullet detonated during extraction. The surgical team worked with extreme caution, using the gentlest possible techniques to avoid jostling or putting pressure on the explosive round. After what must have felt like an eternity to everyone in that operating room, the bullet was successfully removed without incident and carefully transported by the bomb squad to a secure location where it could be safely disposed of. Fact 11. Reagan lost half his blood. At age 70, Ronald Reagan was the oldest person ever elected to the presidency, and conventional medical wisdom suggested that a man his age would have little chance of surviving the trauma of a gunshot wound combined with massive blood loss. But Reagan's survival defied those expectations, and doctors later credited his remarkable physical condition for keeping him alive when the odds were stacked against him. By the time surgeons had stopped the internal bleeding and stabilized his condition, Reagan had lost more than half of his total blood volume, an amount that would have killed most people his age within minutes. The average human body contains about 5 to 6 liters of blood, and Reagan had lost approximately 3 liters before doctors could get the hemorrhaging under control. What saved him was the fact that despite being in his 8th decade of life, Reagan had the cardiovascular system and physical resilience of someone decades younger. He had spent years maintaining an intensive exercise routine that included regular swimming, horseback riding, and weight training at his California ranch, and he had the muscular build and low body fat percentage that would be more typical of a man in his 30s or 40s. Doctors examining him after the surgery were astonished to find that his heart, lungs, and circulatory system showed minimal signs of aging, and his body had been able to compensate for the catastrophic blood loss, far better than medical textbooks would have predicted for a 70-year-old patient. The combination of his excellent baseline fitness and the speed with which he received medical care made the difference between life and death, and his recovery progressed much faster than anyone expected, with Reagan walking the hospital corridors within days of the shooting. Fact 12. A TF traced the gun in 16 minutes. The moment law enforcement officers secured John Hinckley Jr. at the scene and recovered his weapon, a remarkable display of investigative efficiency began unfolding behind the scenes. Agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms immediately began the process of tracing the revolver's ownership history, a task that normally could take hours or even days, depending on how many times the weapon had changed hands. But in this case, the urgency of a presidential assassination attempt meant that every available resource was mobilized, and every shortcut was taken to identify where Hinckley had obtained the gun. Starting with the serial number stamped on the revolver's frame, ATF agents worked backwards through manufacturer records, wholesale distributor logs, and retail sales receipts, making phone calls and accessing databases at a frantic pace. Just 16 minutes after beginning the trace, federal agents had their answer. The weapon had been sold by a pawn shop called Rocky's, located in Dallas, Texas. This remains one of the fastest successful gun traces in the history of American law enforcement, a testament to both the skill of the investigators and the efficiency of the firearm tracking systems that were in place even in 1981. Within hours, agents were interviewing the pawn shop employees who had sold Hinckley the weapon, obtaining copies of the sales records and any identification information he had provided at the time of purchase. The speed of the trace was crucial because investigators initially didn't know if Hinckley had acted alone or if he was part of a larger conspiracy, and identifying his movements and purchases in the days leading up to the attack was essential to ruling out the possibility of additional plotters or imminent follow-up attacks. Fact 13. Brady's death ruled homicide 33 years later. James Brady, the White House press secretary who took a bullet to the head during the assassination attempt, survived the shooting but lived the rest of his life with severe disabilities, including partial paralysis, slurred speech, and significant cognitive impairment. He became a prominent advocate for gun control legislation, and the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act that passed in 1993 was named in his honor. But the strangest legal twist in his story came in August of 2014, when Brady died at the age of 73. The medical examiner in Virginia, where Brady passed away, conducted an examination and made a determination that shocked legal experts across the country. Brady's death was officially ruled a homicide caused by the gunshot wound he had suffered 33 years earlier. The medical examiner concluded that the brain damage and related health complications from the 1981 shooting had directly contributed to his death more than 3 decades later, making it one of the longest gaps between a violent attack and a homicide ruling in American legal history. This created a bizarre legal situation because John Hinckley Jr. had already been tried for the shooting back in 1982, found not guilty by reason of insanity, and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Under the constitutional prohibition against double jeopardy, prosecutors could not charge Hinckley with murder for Brady's death, even though it had been officially ruled a homicide because he had already faced trial for crimes stemming from that same shooting. Legal scholars debated whether the double jeopardy clause truly applied in this situation, since the murder charge would technically be for a different crime than attempted murder, but prosecutors ultimately decided not to pursue the case, and Hinckley faced no additional legal consequences for a death that was directly attributed to his actions. Fact 14. The taxi driver connection. John Hinckley Jr.'s motivation for attempting to assassinate President Reagan was rooted in a delusional obsession that began when he watched Martin Scorsese's film Taxi Driver in theaters. The movie, which starred Robert De Niro as an unstable Vietnam veteran plotting to assassinate a political candidate, featured a young Jodie Foster playing a teenage prostitute. Hinckley became fixated on Foster after seeing the film and watched it at least 15 times, often sitting through multiple showings in a single day at various movie theaters. His obsession grew into a full-blown delusion where he convinced himself that if he could recreate the assassination plot from the movie in real life, Jodie Foster would finally notice him and fall in love with him. Hinckley began stalking Foster, who was attending Yale University at the time, and he wrote her numerous letters expressing his feelings and describing his plans to do something historic that would prove his devotion to her. Foster never responded to his letters and was deeply disturbed by his unwanted attention, but Hinckley interpreted her silence as a challenge that required an even more dramatic gesture. In the weeks before the assassination attempt, Hinckley actually considered several different targets, including President Jimmy Carter and various other political figures, before finally settling on Reagan simply because the president's public schedule was easy to obtain and offered opportunities for an attack. The parallels to Taxi Driver were deliberate and extensive. In the film, De Niro's character attempts to assassinate a presidential candidate to impress Foster's character, and Hinckley saw himself as living out that same narrative in reality, unable to distinguish between the fictional world of the movie and actual consequences of violence. Fact 15. Reagan never walked a tarmac again. The psychological impact of the assassination attempt extended far beyond Ronald Reagan himself and deeply affected his wife Nancy, who became intensely protective of her husband's safety for the remainder of his presidency. Nancy Reagan had always been a strong presence in the White House and fiercely devoted to her husband. But after watching him nearly die from a gunshot wound, she developed what staff members described as an almost obsessive concern for his physical security. One of the most significant changes she demanded involved how the president traveled and appeared in public spaces. Before the shooting, it was common for presidents to walk across airport tarmacs, wave to crowds from open sidewalks, and make impromptu public appearances with relatively minimal security precautions. But Nancy Reagan put an absolute stop to these practices, insisting that her husband would never again expose himself to the kind of vulnerable situation that had nearly cost him his life outside the Washington Hilton. For the remaining years of Reagan's presidency, he never walked across an airport tarmac in public view, instead being driven directly to and from Air Force One in motorcades or entering through secured areas away from public sight. He never stepped out of his armored limousine on a public sidewalk where crowds could gather, and his public appearances were limited to carefully controlled environments with extensive security screening. Secret Service agents privately welcomed these restrictions because they made their jobs significantly easier. But some political advisors worried that the increased distance between Reagan and the American public might damage his popular appeal. Nancy Reagan didn't care about the political calculations and made it clear that her husband's safety was non-negotiable, and Reagan himself, perhaps understanding how close he had come to death, never fought her on these security measures.